Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today, we're joined by a friend and fellow death doula, Nicole Junkerman. She is a retired police officer and the founder of Positive Passing. Grief is a universal experience, but for those in high stress professions like law enforcement, it comes with its own set of complexities. In this episode, we're going to talk about the unique challenges that police officers and their families face when it comes to grieving. Nicole will share her personal experiences from her time in law enforcement and how these experiences have shaped her approach as a death doula. Nicole, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start off by telling us a bit about your background as a police officer and how you transitioned into becoming a death doula?
Absolutely. I, from a very young age, as long as I can remember, always wanted to be a police officer. Finally became a police officer, and I was even a field training officer. So I had somebody that I was training to be a police officer, who is now a corporal, and I am very proud of him, by the way. We still keep in touch, and yes, I still call him a rookie, even though, like I said, he's not a corporal. He's a ranking officer. Super proud of him. But I, loving life on the road, and then I went to an advanced defensive tactics training where I actually broke my neck in training. Did not realize that it was my neck at the time. I thought it was my shoulder because of the pain going down my arm, and it went all the way down to my trigger finger. So that in itself was a little scary. And then the fact that they couldn't figure out what it was at first, because I thought that the pain was coming from my shoulder. So that's where they were doing all of the testing, found out later that it was, in fact, a broken neck, had to have neck surgery, and actually had 3 spinal surgeries since then. But I was forced to medically retire. Not how anyone wants to end their career. I struggled immensely. I had about a year that I had 0 income. I had 2 small kids at the time, single mom. That was a huge struggle, maxing out credit cards, going through savings. And then the silver lining that, hindsight's 2020, so I didn't see it, but at the time, but the silver lining of the injury and everything that I went through, I was able to spend every day with my grandfather for the last year of his life. That man is my hero. To this day, he is my hero. It's been almost 10 years since he died, but I miss him like crazy. But still my hero. But I got to spend every day with him. I got to be there in the end. And then, ironically enough, the same week that he passed, I was cleared to work. So work again. Obviously not in law enforcement, but I'm at the cemetery with my grandmother, and they're wrapping everything up. And the cemeterian says, "Is there anything else that I can help you guys with?" I swear at that point in time, my grandfather was still taking care of me, even in his passing, because I had this overwhelming feeling, not the most appropriate time, but this overwhelming feeling to ask the cemetery. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, are you guys hiring? And he gave me the strangest look. And that's when I realized like how inappropriate I was being. He's like, well, actually we are. Maybe we get this taken care of and we talk to you afterwards. And I was like, yeah, that's probably smarter. So the week after my grandfather's service, I started working at the cemetery. Truly thought it was going to be, this is just a job so that I can start catching up on bills again. We're not just eating generic everything. We have got something with a little more flavor, that kind of stuff. And I loved it. I never thought I would have loved it. But I was still
What were you doing? Like, what did you do for them starting off?
I didn't dig the graves or anything. I met with the families. I would sell them plots. I would even help them like plan. Sometimes we would sell caskets, headstones. But I was there for them when their family had just passed. Most of the time. Now, some of the pre-planning, obviously not, but generally it was when somebody had just passed. So I would help them, not necessarily plan the service because that was for the funeral home to do, but make sure everything went off without a hitch, or at least nothing that they knew about the day of at the cemetery. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was still helping people in one of their worst days. And I think that that's why I enjoyed it so much. That, and I feel like in a cemetery, there's just a calm, quiet peacefulness. And it doesn't matter, like it can be on the busiest highway in the world. As soon as you walk in there, it's like the outside, it's almost like there's a dome over it and the outside world is kind of shut out. And it's just so calm and quiet and peaceful. And I absolutely loved it. I moved up to manage 3 local cemeteries in the area within 2 years. And at that point, I had a local funeral home. They called me one day. We had just had a service for them. And they called and wanted to know if whenever I got a chance, if I could come down and talk to them. The general manager did. And I was like, yeah, is everything okay with that service? Like, is the family upset about something? When they left, they seemed good. I don't want to say happy, but satisfied. And he's like, oh yeah, it's nothing, just whenever you have a chance. Well, my anxiety, I had a chance right then and there. so, so I went down to talk to him. And as soon as I got there, he's like, you want to close the door? I was like, oh, great. I was like, I messed up big time. And I was very nervous. Close the door, have a seat. And I start talking to him and he's like, how happy are you where you are? And I was like, I'm actually quite happy. He's like, well, we think that you would be happier here. And 2 weeks later, that seemed to be my theme at the time. 2 weeks later, I started at the funeral home. I wore many, many hats there. I did life insurance for them. I worked as an administrative assistant. The general manager that kind of brought me in the door, he and I opened a new location for them, which became such a baby of mine. When I finally decided to go to mortuary school, I had a very hard time leaving there to go back to their main campus because I had literally put a lot of my own personal blood, sweat, and tears into that. So I struggled with that. But then I went back and I was going to mortuary school. And I had a love-hate relationship with it. I was enjoying the job. Loved meeting with the families, hearing how wonderful their loved ones were. But then I would struggle going and embalming or preparing their loved one because in my mind, I'm just replaying these beautiful stories that the families have just shared. And I'm like, I never even had an opportunity. I was being selfish about it. I was like, I never even had an opportunity to know this person. And now I'm embalming them. So I struggled with that a little bit. And then I had some personal family things that I was struggling with. So I stepped away from the funeral business and I took a grief recovery course, which turned out to be awesome because my son was in the police academy at the time. And one of the things in the grief recovery course that you do is you write a letter to whomever your grief is with. Well, the letter I wrote was to myself as a recruit police officer. And then I did it to officer. It was Thorns at the time. I wasn't married at the time. And then I finished the letter to just Nicole, because ultimately that's who I am. And they, in this program, suggest that you bury the letter, you set the letter on fire, you shred it, something. That way, if just say, my grief was with you, Traci, and I wrote the letter to you, I don't necessarily share it with you. I just kind of get that out. So I decided that I was going to burn my letters. I don't know why, but that's what I decided. But instead of just doing it wherever, I would take my letters to a significant place that, like, because one of the other letters that I had done was for my mom. We would always go to the beach. So I burnt the letter at the beach. Well, I decided that I was going to burn my letter to Officer Thorns at the police academy. And it wasn't until, not in the building, there was no arson or anything involved. It was like in the parking lot. Sorry, I always have to say that because people look at me and they're like, you did what? No, it was in the parking lot. But it wasn't until I was burning the letter, and for whatever reason, I felt the need to take a picture of this one. And as I'm looking at the picture, I see the police academy in the background. And that's when it dawned on me that that's where my career literally began and ended, because that's where I was when I broke my neck, which was kind of full circle for me. It was good. After that, I actually went back to the funeral home for a short time. That's when I had to have my third spinal surgery. So while I was out for that, I had a vice principal, my middle school vice principal. I ran into him and he was talking to me about death doulas. And I was like, I've never heard of that. What is that? And he's like, you're still at the funeral home, right? And I was like, I am. And I had a big old back brace on. I was like, but I'm out for a couple weeks. So he knows me well enough. He says, if you are interested in it, you'll look it up. All he did was plant that little tiny seed, and he knew that it would eat at me enough, just the fact that I had no idea what he was talking about. So I went home and I started researching, and I was like, oh, wow, this is what I want to do, because I get, again, very selfishly, I get the best of both worlds. I get to know the person before they pass, but yet I get to know the family, and I still get to hear all the great stories and all of that fun stuff, and be there for everything.
We met because I also am inspired to work with first responders and grief. And it was funny, our conversation when we first met, because he said, yeah, I'm doing this in Chicago, or I'm helping in Chicago with some. And I laughed because my brother,
Your brother, yeah.
my brother's a Chicago police officer. I'm like, okay, next time you do that, I'm coming out. I'm coming out to help.
Yes.
So you are already helping in that realm. In your experience, what are some of the unique challenges that police officers and their families face when it comes to dealing with grief?
I personally never really thought about the families until I became the family. And what I mean by that is, now that my son is on the road, I wasn't married to a police officer. Now that I'm married, my husband is a retired police officer, but he wasn't, like, we've never been on the road while we were married. So I never had that. Yes, I thought about my kids, but they were little and I tried to shield them from that kind of stuff. But I never thought about the impact that my job necessarily had on my family until I became the family. And it's hard. It's hard to just kind of sit back and watch and listen. And I just recently had a conversation with a mom who said to me, she's like, my son isn't like yours. Mine doesn't call me when he's on his way to danger and tell me when he's on his way to, and do the real quick love you, bye, and just hang up and hope that you heard everything. My son has done that. He's like, on my way to a barricaded situation, love you, bye. And you don't call, you don't text, you just wait to hear from them. And she expressed, and I never thought about it, how difficult that is with, I find out about it through the grapevine. It's on the news or somebody posted on social media. She's like, and then I find out that that's where my son is. She's like, and I don't hear the aspect of, I don't get the I love you bye before he goes or anything like that. And I tried explaining to her how my son does that with me because he knows that I understand what he is going into. He doesn't do that with his father. His father wasn't a police officer. And I've even talked to my son about this. Like, why do you? And I'm not doing that to discourage him at all. I love those conversations. But why do you call me and not your dad? And he even said, he's like, Dad's not going to get it. He doesn't know what I'm on my way to. He doesn't understand. He hasn't lived that life. And I knew that I had a family, but I never thought about the aspect that it had on my family when I was on the road. Yeah. Cause like I said, my kids were little. So although there was one time I was at a barricaded situation and I was supposed to be able to get like my kids from something. I don't even remember what it was. I was going to take my lunch hour during whatever time. When you're on barricaded situations, you don't do that. And I had my cell phone in my shirt pocket calling my sister, hey, I need you to pick the kids up. It was a little like, at the time, but now it's funny because, everybody went home safe that night. But at the time I was like, this isn't the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah, definitely. Why? I know that we talked about grief and when you're doing these workshops, why do you think it's particularly difficult for police officers and other first responders to grieve openly, to be vulnerable?
We live in a world where it is suck it up, buttercup. Like that's not a phrase I've made up. That is a phrase that it's been around for decades. And you get upset or, you just did have a bad call and it's, suck it up, buttercup. You got to go to the next call. And to some extent it is, you don't have time to decompress in between calls because there's calls waiting because you did have that barricaded situation or whatever to have even extra law enforcement called in. So you don't have the opportunity to send officers. So calls are just kind of stacking up. And unfortunately, just because our world has stopped doing whatever that incident is, doesn't mean that the rest of the world has stopped. So you suck it up, buttercup, for a little bit. And you keep on going. I will say that at least the departments in the area around here where I am had started peer support meetings, peer support groups, which I am a part of, helping with those as well, as best I can. And they also will do debriefings that we didn't necessarily do when I was on the road, which I feel like those are huge. They're going to ultimately, I think, save officers a lot of grief. That and the peer support allows them to know that they have a very safe place to sit and talk to someone. And by safe, I mean, you can cry, you can yell, you can cuss, you can whatever you need to do to kind of get the grief out, as long as you are safe about it. I mean, if you indicate any, danger to yourself or others, something has to be done. But sometimes it's good to just, yell and scream and cry and just kind of get that emotion out instead of letting it kind of like a splinter stay inside and fester and irritate.
But I know with the support groups, it's not that they're immediate, right? They're not that peer support. So when you have a really difficult day, and you have several calls and then you go home, what coping mechanisms did you find that you were using or that colleagues were using to handle this grief while serving?
Me personally, I was not using coping mechanisms. I know a lot of other officers that didn't used to use coping mechanisms. It was just if we kind of like if we don't think about it, if we don't talk about it, it's not there type of thing. Um, but it is. It's still very much there. And it's like that splinter that I said, it just kind of festers until it gets infected. Um, I will say now that I'm out of it, it's much easier to like look at my son. And if he's had a bad day, I know it because I get a phone call. And sometimes I'll get a phone call in the middle of the day. You're not going to believe what I just had. And I think just that helps. I've had other officers that will call and say, you know, I just had such and such. Can I just kind of tell you what happened and what I did? And they're second guessing themselves, but they just need somebody with fresh eyes that isn't necessarily on the road with them to make sure that they know that they did the right thing.
How does media representation of police officers influence or add to the trauma that officers go through?
I'm going to take it even a step further with not just media, but like the social media aspect of it, especially with, and then the officers wearing the body cams that they have. And see, we didn't wear body cams when I was on the road. It's been almost 12 years ago since I was on the road. And we didn't do, we just, they were starting to come out, but the agency that I was with didn't have them. And it makes it harder because you're not just vulnerable to yourself or your partner or even the person that you're interacting with, because you've got everybody out there. Everybody and their brother wants either a picture or a video. So that makes you vulnerable to the entire world. And that's scary for anybody, but especially somebody that's supposed to be coming out larger than life type of attitude, or maybe not attitude. Like they're supposed to be out there serving and protecting. And if they are showing that they're vulnerable, what are they able to serve and protect is I feel how the public will view. And I feel like a lot of officers feel that way as well.
Do a lot of officers, do they get engaged with the communities that they help serve? And how is something like those cameras and now social media, how has that been affected? Are they unable, I mean, do they have to distance themselves now more from the communities they serve?
I have found that some of them will try and do it in a completely different aspect. Um, Again, this wasn't something that was seen when I was on the road, but I had this small kid, so I knew when report cards came out or midterms came out, and I would go into these underprivileged neighborhoods that I worked in, and I would have in my duty bag, there would either be candy or like a stuffed animal or something. And I'm like, all right, let me see your progress report. Let me see your report card. And if the younger kids, I was going to say if they did well, it ended up that as long as they showed it to me, they could pick something out of the bag. But yet some of the ones that, okay, you could do a little better in this area. I've seen you read. Why is your grade whatever in reading? I've seen you read before. You read that book to me, 2 weeks ago, remember? And but still, okay, but I know you can do it. So you can get a piece of candy too. Or I know a lot of the SROs. I loved watching the videos of a lot of the SROs will do like the TikTok videos with the kids in school. I think that they are trying to find a way to make it a positive thing. Or I know officers that have been sent to like shut down a lemonade stand because, we're supposed to have permits for things, but instead they go when they buy lemonade or, they're playing basketball. And again, a lot of this has to do with kids, but you have to start somewhere. And if you start with the kids now, maybe they won't be quite as ready to do the horrible things. Or if they know the officer, even if they are in a dire situation, they've already got that connection with them, maybe they will listen or make a right decision when the time comes.
Yeah, that having that relationship with the community, I remember growing up and officer friendly and having
Yes.
officer friendly come out and really, and I remember they used to bring these little, almost like comic books for
Yes.
us that were really had to do with the law, right? And that relationship really, I'm very fortunate. I understand that. I was never afraid of police officers because I grew up in an environment where I didn't need to be.
And that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
I
and
always,
I'm
I
very
always,
fortunate, as I said.
yeah. Well, I always hated when parents would be like, if you don't act right, they're going to arrest you. No, no, that makes them scared of us. Let them come up and talk to us and figure out what we're about. Don't put that fear in them. Yeah.
Now, you have a very unique perspective because you've stepped away from your role as a police officer. Are you now more aware of some of the cultural or institutional barriers within the police department that makes grieving a bit more difficult?
I think so. And I think, like you said, stepping away from it makes it easier to see those things. Not only that, I didn't realize that grief was so many different things. I always, excuse me, I always attributed grief to death, not, I've gotten a promotion at work. And while this is a great thing, I'm super excited. Well, now I'm on a different shift, or, my schedule has completely flip-flopped, and the week that I had taken off for vacation to spend with my family, well, I can't get that week now because I'm taking this new position. And a lot of people that I am finding don't realize that that is in itself a grief, even the good things.
Do you feel that the leadership and policies that they play a role in either supporting or hindering officers' ability to grieve?
Yes. But I will say, and again, when I wasn't, or when I left the police department, I've told you I struggled immensely. So my biggest way of coping is isolation. So that's what I did. It wasn't until my son, because my son works at the same department that I worked for. So it wasn't until him really going back there that I kind of let them back in, or I went like back to the department. Um, and to see the way things have changed from when I was there to now is, it doesn't make it quite as scary for a mom to have her son on the road, because there are things in place. They do have, you know, they have the debriefings almost immediately afterwards if they can. That you've had a rough call. Okay, we're going to sit together. We're going to talk about it. And if they can't do it immediately, they will call everyone back in and we talk about it.
When you say we, who are the we?
Sorry, we would be the officers involved, a clinician if needed. Um, it's not necessarily like the higher ups. It's generally their immediate supervisors and the ones involved in whatever the incident is. Obviously, if more people need to be brought in, they are, like a clinician or what have you. Or I've just even noticed that recently, where officers, may express that they're struggling. Okay, like even the higher ups. Okay, what can we do to help you? Or we'll send them to talk to someone, or we'll call in a peer for them to have that conversation with someone that they can relate to, but without feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm talking to the brass, which would be like the higher ups, like almost like being called into the principal's office, or mom and dad want to have that conversation with us. So it makes it a little easier if it's one of your subordinates instead of superiors.
I know that there are a lot of politics at play.
Right.
And I know that there are a lot of demands that are coming from outside of the police department. So what can we do that's better?
I kind of hate to even almost speak on it because I'm not 100%. But I believe that there is a new law coming into effect that conversations had in peer support groups can be subpoenaed. That in itself, me personally, I'm going to isolate. I'm not going to go to that peer support meeting, and I'm not going to tell you how I'm feeling, because I'm not going to have my thoughts and my feelings subpoenaed in court. The last I heard, it was they're working on it not being a thing. So I'm not what, that's why I say I almost hate to speak on it because I'm not 100%. But that is definitely something that would help to not be in play. And it's funny because there are times that I have been called like, hey, I need to talk to somebody. And I'm like, okay, are you talking to me as a peer or are you talking to me as a mom? Because if you're calling me like, hey mom, and not even just my son, like his friends or other officers that he works with, because if you're just talking to me as a mom, it's nothing peer support related. And that is how I am trying to, because you can have that conversation with anybody and it not be, and it's more of a protected conversation.
Yeah. And that's also with doulas also, right? If they have these conversations with someone like me, like
Yes.
you, that we don't have to report up, or of course if there is something that is dangerous, we would
Right.
say something, but
Yes. Although a story with doula, it's awesome for the thing, not the family, for the person that's passing to let you in close enough, especially at such a sacred time. I had a lady, Melissa, it was just a year anniversary since she passed, and she, sweet lady, she wanted her Buddha flags in her living room because she couldn't get back into her bedroom again. And she kept calling them her finish line. And when she reached them, she had finally reached the other side. And she's like, but her family wasn't Buddhist. And she wasn't sure how they would take that. So tag I'm in, I got to have that conversation with them on, she hasn't specifically asked for this, but I feel like this would make her feel a little more comfortable. And as soon as I told them, they brought the flags out. And I don't know if you saw the picture that I just recently shared, but those were her flags that they sent me the day that she passed, and they said she's reached the finish line. And it's awesome to know that you could have that conversation with someone and that they were vulnerable enough to let you in, and you were able to facilitate something to make them feel better when you know that they're at the end. And it's just one of those small little things that helps them get to where they're trying to go, like her finish line.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to current police officers and first responders who are struggling with grief?
Talk about it. It's not going to go away. Even when you talk about it, it's not going to fix it. It's still not going to make it go away, but it doesn't give it the same power over you when you have those discussions about it. When you try and let it go, it gets better. And my biggest thing is, and I don't do this every time, there are times that I can tell stories of, where I came from and I cry. There are other times that I can tell the story and there are no tears. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're healing or you're not. Sometimes when you're crying, you're happy because you have come as far as you have. And I do think that just kind of getting it out and off your chest is a huge relief in itself. And it doesn't even always necessarily have to be a clinician or something that you're talking to.
How can death doulas and other professionals support first responders and their families in dealing with grief?
I think if you see something, if you notice a difference in someone, especially as like a friend or family member or something like that, if you notice a difference in them, or even you think, wow, that's a lot, that would be difficult for me, that's heavy, talk to them. And I truly think have that difficult conversation of, are you okay? And 9 times out of 10, especially if you're talking to a first responder, you're going to get, yup, no, are you really okay? And take the time to, like, if it's appropriate, a hand on the shoulder, a hand on the, touch them, some sort of physical contact, and look them in the eye. No, are you really okay? Tell me what's going on. What are you thinking? How are you handling that? And maybe even sharing, expressing how you would feel in that situation. I feel like whatever would be really heavy because of fill in the blank. And that kind of opens the door for them to say, yeah, it kind of was. And this is what I'm doing. Or if they really clam up about it, remind them, okay, you don't want to talk about it. I get it. I'm going to keep asking. My biggest thing is I will tell people, I'm going to bug you until I feel like you are okay. I'm going to bug you. And I have one officer that he'll and I know when he's having a hard time because I will just get the emoji of a bug. And that is his way of telling me, I need you to check on me without me saying I need help. And that's fine. That is fine. And I'll either text him back or I'll call him and I'll be like, hey, how, and I don't even necessarily, hey, what's wrong? What happens? Hey, how's your dog? How's your kid? How's life? What are you doing to take care of you? When was the last time you ate? Or was the last time you slept? You showered today? Like the basic needs that we forget to do or we just don't care about when we are grieving or dealing with the heavy stuff.
Just having a person listening, even if it has nothing to do with what had happened with the grief, is so powerful.
Yes.
That practical stuff, when I'm doing grief work, it's not just about sitting down and talking. Sometimes we go on a walk and we talk, but sometimes it's just, hey, let's go get some groceries.
Yes.
Let's do something outside because that's what's needed. That
Absolutely.
is, people need people to show up.
Yes. And this isn't police related, but I had a lady last week with my business. Her husband had passed. She didn't call me until after he had passed. And she wanted someone to go with her to the funeral home just to pick up the urn. So we did. And it was after that she's like, can we go to lunch? Because I live in Berlin, Maryland. So it's a cool little funky town. And her husband would go to this one restaurant for lunch a lot. And she's like, can we go to lunch? And we went there. And she's like, I have to get a cheeseburger. And we just sat there and we talked about it. And she, as we were leaving, 2 hours later, she's giving me this big hug and she's like, thank you for just being here today. And that I think is what people need more than anything. You hit the nail on the head with that. Just show up. It's huge.
And sometimes, yes, they're going to want to talk about things and they might cry. I know with my grief work, yeah. I mean, I get calls at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And I'm there for them because it's really difficult. But other days, it's just, okay, we have to go out and do something at the Social Security Administration. Great. Okay, let's, as you said, let's go out for coffee. Let's go,
Right.
can we just go out? I just need. to decompress. So that's important.
It is. It is. And there are times that I can tell that they need something, but instead of saying, what do you need? Be like, I could really go for a coffee today, or I really need some ice cream. And, making them think that they're being there for you when it's actually the other way around is a nice little trick, I'd like to say, that I've found.
So I want to talk about your book. I know that you wrote a book for children, and I'm so excited for it. For children of first responders, it's called Daddy's Home.
Yes.
I want to talk about it. I want to know how you came up with the idea.
So many things with this book. My son was in the police academy. It was 4 days before he was to graduate. There was a line of duty death in our area. It was also coming up on the 10-year anniversary of my injury. So there were just all sorts of emotions flowing for me, all sorts of grief flowing for me. The grief recovery program that I did, we would journal. So I started journaling. And as I'm journaling, I'm like, I feel like this might be able to be something. So I kept playing with it, and I decided that I was going to write it as a line of duty death for kids so that they can understand what happens when daddy doesn't come home through the front door, but he's home in heaven. And it kind of brings all of my worlds together, with the police officer aspect of it and the funeral home aspect of it. I wasn't a doula at the time of writing this. But I struggled with, I never received a last call, which as a police officer is the last time that your number is said on the radio. And it's like your final goodbye. And I never got that. And I struggled with that immensely. The officer that had passed, he was not the first officer that I had that had, and I say I had because they're all my family, that I had that had passed. One was, I had worked with him, and he actually completed suicide. And I struggled with that. So I know others did as well. So I wanted to kind of do something so that while it's written for children, it's written in a way that everyone can kind of understand it. And it's to kind of explain what happens when daddy doesn't come home through the front door, after work. And I talked to my kids about it, and it's Daddy's Home because they both agreed that part of me died when I lost my identity as a police officer, because that's truly what happened to me. I struggled to find myself again. So they did not want it to be mommy's home. They're like, nope, been there, done that. So that's why it's Daddy's Home. Every name in the book has significance to me in one way or another. But it is someone that has passed. They are possums. The characters are possums because my son's first day on the road as a police officer, he had an encounter with a possum. So I opted for possums because I struggled. I wanted sea turtles, but I wasn't sure about an underwater theme. My daughter rides horses, but I wanted the mounted unit in it. And cops, you can't have horses riding horses. They just wouldn't be appropriate with it. So when he had the encounter with the possums, that's what I opted for. But the last call that is in the book is actually my ID number. So I was able to give myself my last call, which it it breaks my heart that there is a need for this book. But at the same time, even if no one else were to read it, it was extremely cathartic for me and very healing. Yeah. And
Sounds like it.
It goes through the whole process of, like things that we do with daddy, and we love him so much, and getting him ready for work and his uniform, and even the date in the book, July 11th, 2012. Daddy didn't come home from work. Well, that was the date of my injury. It's while it's helpful for others, it's a very personal book. And it's got where, it explains the shrouded badge to the kids, because not everyone understands that. It explains the police presence, because while a lot of officers do things with their shift or their squad, it's a totally different police presence when someone passes. It's not just, Uncle Ryan, who you always do things with on, when dad's off. It's, you've got the captain there, you've got the chief there, you've got our sheriff, or, depending on your department, you've literally got everybody there. It takes you to the funeral home where you're picking out a casket. Like I said, it's got the last call in there. It even has a page where the main character's name is Hudson. He goes to a doctor because he's having all sorts of emotions. He's angry and sad, and he doesn't understand, and he wants to make sure that he's okay. So mom takes him to the doctor to make sure, for the doctor to reassure him, all these feelings that you're having are normal, and you're right where you should be, basically. And then it ends with, we know it, like in the cemetery. Again, it's got the last call, and then the flag being presented to the family and telling them, we're going to be okay. Dad's taught us to be strong, and daddy's home. He's in heaven.
Wow.
Yeah.
Such a powerful, powerful book.
Yeah. The very first time I ever read it out loud was to a group of kids that were survivors. You want to talk about a room that was potentially full of critics, because they had already lived it. And they were amazing. Like, I'm sitting in the floor with them, and they made what I feel is a pretty good book that much better, because they were engaged and they wanted to see the pictures, and they were explaining, oh, that happened to me, or I remember when they did this for, mom or dad or uncle or whoever. And it was pretty powerful. Yeah.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay.
What message would you like to share with our listeners about the importance of allowing themselves to grieve, especially in those high stress professions? I know we said talk about it, but is there anything else that we could leave people with?
My biggest thing, and I say this personally, don't isolate. Even if you don't talk about it, don't isolate yourself from the rest of the world, because it's going to make it worse. Even if we lived closer and I just called you and said, hey, can we get coffee? And we talked about the weather. Don't isolate. And you don't necessarily have to talk about the issue, but don't push people away.
Yeah, so smart. And I think everyone could learn from that, considering that we have isolated over the last few years.
Very true.
But especially for people who have been taught really not to talk about it.
Right.
So wonderful. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been lovely. Before we wrap up, can you tell our listeners how they can learn about you and your work and get in touch with you?
Yes, I am positive passing. My website is a Zen business, so it is crazy long. But if you look up Nicole Junkerman on Google, you can find it that way. My email is just nicole.positivepassing@gmail, or my book is on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And I'm trying to think. I think the easiest way is probably to Google me. Yeah.
And I'll put your website, that long website,
Yes.
on the description, so people could just link to it.
Awesome.
And I'll put a link to your book also.
Awesome. Thank you.
For folks. You're welcome. So folks, today's conversation has shown us the tough realities police officers and their families face when dealing with grief. Hopefully, hearing Nicole's personal stories and learning about her work with positive passing has provided you with a deeper appreciation for the emotional challenges these professionals go through. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care